Chapter 17, Sikh Temple, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Sunday, August 5th, 2012. Solid. Robert Bob Williams was solid. Unspectacular, but steady. Whether at work or at play, you could always count on Bob. Would he sink the winning basket? No. But he would make the mid-court pick that led to the open man taking the winning shot. That was Bob Williams. He was born and raised in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, a town just south of Milwaukee. He'd tell people he lived in Milwaukee so the inevitable second question wouldn't come up. Well, where is Oak Creek? The same reason someone might say they're from Washington, D.C. rather than Alexandria, Virginia, or from Boston, Massachusetts rather than Cambridge. Bob grew to be about 5'9", about 200 pounds, a little chunky, but not too chunky. Good looking in an outdoorsy, working with your hands, beer, steak, and baked potato kind of way. Not a head turner, not a cringe inducer. Solid. Bob liked keeping things orderly and to a minimum. He got that from home, from his parents, Oliver and Nancy. Oliver was a used car salesperson with Frontier Motor Cars in Milwaukee. He'd started with them when they opened in 1976. He had offers to move since then, but was comfortable there, making a good living, and he didn't like change. Nancy was the office manager for KEI, a Milwaukee area commercial landscape company. She knew where everything was, where everybody was, and where they were supposed to be at any given time. Oliver's dislike of change and Nancy's devotion to detail combined to form an interesting dichotomy at home. The single-family detached home where Bob lived all his life was clean and pristine, almost museum-like quality. It had the feeling of not being lived in. Dishes were always done, completely, right after a meal. Beds were always made when you first woke up. If you ate in front of the TV, watching a Packers game, you'd better run the vacuum right after you were done. Everything was done. Everything had its place. Bob's friends called his house the museum. No wonder he loved going with his parents to their workplace, especially to his mother's KEI. Occasionally, she'd pick him up from school and take him to a project they were working on. Landscaping for a house, an apartment complex, a park. It made no difference to young Bob. He loved watching the work, the hoeing, the raking, the planting, the cutting, the trimming. He loved what they created from dirt, rocks, forest. As he grew older and began to take even more of an interest in landscaping, Nancy was able to secure him a part-time job with KEI to see if he enjoyed doing as much as he enjoyed watching. Bob did. From an early age, when the workers would describe what they were trying to accomplish, Bob could see it. How moving that clump of trees, creating that small hill, digging this ditch toward the pond, erecting this wooden bridge over that just dug ditch would create a beautiful walkway through a park. When a job was completed, a contract successfully finished, Bob would feel an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, almost as if he'd been the only one to work on it. He worked for KEI up through his graduation from Oak Creek High School. Evenings, weekends, summers, even winters, helping to plow snow. Any chance Bob had, Bob took to gain as much experience as possible. And for the money. Bob had a plan. He was going to the University of Wisconsin, major in landscaping, then come back home to Oak Creek and open his own landscaping business. It would be almost a combination of his folks. Oliver had essentially built his own business within Frontier Motors' four walls. His clients came back because of him, not because of the snazzy new interior. And Nancy's the one who introduced him to landscaping. KEI had been her life, besides her family. Bob had saved everything. He'd not gone out with friends, to sporting events, to dances, including his own prom. He had good friends, and the occasional girlfriend. They understood what his number one priority was. He wanted to go to college. He didn't just want to, he needed to. There was only one small challenge. Bob's grades weren't particularly good. He tried. He studied. He put the work in. It's just that while his mind could easily grasp the complexities of turning a pile of rocky refuse into a well-manicured playground, it couldn't hang on to basic English composition or American history or the logic of elemental logic. It took several tries, including letters from some of his high school teachers as well as his employer at KEI, for him to be accepted. He graduated from Oak Creek High in May 1995 and was finally accepted, one of only about 52%, and began classes at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in January 1996. College wasn't easy for Bob Williams, even the landscaping courses. He wasn't joining fraternities. He wasn't in bars. In fact, he was pinching every penny he could lay his hands on. And he was studying and working part-time in the school's cafeteria and studying, sometimes in his room, sometimes in the library, sometimes outside. He was a solid student, a B.C. student, but it took an awful lot of work to get him there. But he got there. In May 2000, Bob graduated with a 2.70 GPA and bachelor's in landscaping, two beaming parents watching, and what he was most proud of, with what would have been his original class if he had entered in September 1995. Robert Williams Landscaping, LLC began immediately. Bob wanted to take advantage of any summer business he could find. Slowly, methodically, Bob began to build his clientele. A friend of his wanted to redo his backyard. A neighborhood church wanted to put a reflection area on the grounds. A local pool wanted to add a playground. And Bob would deliver. The results were like Bob. Solid, steady. Nothing flashy, but he got the job done. His customers, happy. Bob started and grew the business from his and his parents' home. Bob hated change as much as his father, so even with increased revenue, bringing increased challenges, he still didn't want to move. However, with success and expansion came the necessity to branch out, to purchase more equipment, hire laborers, and present to his increasing client base a sharper, cleaner vision of Robert Williams Landscaping. Finally, Bob became one of the first tenants of the Oakview Business Park, located on South Howell Avenue in Oak Creek. Bob continued his slow expansion process. Over a period of several years, he joined the South Suburban Chamber of Commerce, a Business Network International, BNI, chapter, the local Toastmasters chapter, and Rotary International. His advertising began with ads and event sponsorship through the chamber. He then added some print and media advertising, always with a local theme, always just one central message in the ad, so any potential customers wouldn't be confused by what he was trying to offer. It was just such a radio ad, primarily focused on the nonprofit religious community of Oak Creek and Milwaukee, that caught the attention of a group that had just bought 13 acres of land near the airport in Oak Creek. They had outgrown their temple on the south side of Milwaukee, and now it was time to expand. The group was the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, and the new Gurdwara, or temple, would be located at 7512 South Howell Avenue, just down the street from Robert Williams Landscaping. It was by phone that Bob first met Satwant Singh Kaleka, one of the founders of the Gurdwara, as well as its first and only leader and president. Satwant was also the owner of a successful gas station, so was familiar with not only the spiritual aspect of building a new temple, but the financial side as well, being one of the lead investors. Through several meetings held in Bob's new offices, he and Satwant came to an agreement not only on the initial landscaping of the property, but also its long-term maintenance. After the contracts were drawn up and signed, Bob couldn't help but ask the question, why me? Why my company? Satwant's response was a lesson Bob was to repeat to others the rest of his life. Because you didn't judge a book by its cover. I do not look like you. I do not sound like you. And yet, from our very first phone meeting, you showed me nothing but courtesy, kindness, and respect. When you met me, you didn't look at the way I dress, my dastar, what you call a turban. You looked in my eye. Your handshake was firm. I knew that I was dealing with a businessman, yes, but also a man who hopefully will become my friend and a friend of our Gurdwara. Bob's response made Satwant smile. I learned that from my father. He's a car salesman. He only judged a book by its cover once early in his career. A guy in jeans and a dirty t-shirt came into his dealership looking at trucks. My dad was busy with a rookie who had just signed with the Packers, so he gave him the brush off. Another salesman at the dealership ended up selling the scruffy, dirty guy six trucks. He just received a huge, long-term contract from the city of Milwaukee and needed 6 trucks to start. Laughter from both. My dad learned his lesson and passed it on to me. Wise is the man who only steps in the mud puddle once. Because of his evolving friendship with Satwant, Bob took a much keener interest and involvement in the temple project. He would visit the site at least 2 or 3 times a week, not only supervising but also doing what gave him so much pleasure in his younger years. Laying sod, planting trees, flattening the parking area, helping to build and position the playground equipment. He almost always saw Satwant there. He also began to see others with and without him. Suveg Singh Katra was an older member whose taxi driver's son would drop him off at the site. He had this wonderful white beard, very friendly, and was sincerely inquisitive. He couldn't speak any English, so he'd use his hands to ask Bob's crew about themselves, their family, why they were doing certain jobs. Bob would get a call from the project foreman. "The cab just came. He's here." Bob would drive a few blocks to the site, intercept Suvig, and tour the site with him so his crew could finish the project and not hike up Bob's labor cost. Bob adored the old man, so it was a labor of love. Plus, Suvig had just moved to the States in 2004, and Bob would try to teach him fragments of English. When Suvig would smile and say haltingly, "Hello, my friend Bob," it would almost bring him to tears. Robert Williams Landscaping was just getting started when Satwant came to Bob with a request. There was a member of the temple who was working odd jobs here and there to send money back home to his family in India, but he needed something steadier. Satwant would personally vouch for him. If he didn't work out after 30 days, Bob would let Satwant know, and he'd pull the member off the job and give him something to do. That's how Bob met Ranjit Singh. Bob never had to come to Satwant with any challenges. Ranjit was a hard worker and continued as part of the maintenance crew after the temple was open. Then there was the priest. Prakash Singh was much younger than Suveg, spoke English, and cared even more deeply, if possible, about the project. He became a priest with the temple while in the final stages of building and landscaping were being completed. He'd usually arrive with Satwant, but occasionally by himself. Bob learned early on that Prakash was a devoted family man. Unfortunately, his family was in India, and he did not know when he'd be back to get them. Until he could bring his family to Oak Creek, the Gurdwara was Prakash's heart and soul. He, like Satwant, understood the importance of the landscape surrounding the building, the feeling of peace and serenity, a place where the Sikh community could come together both inside and outside, from their children in the playground up to and including the elders. The opening ceremony was Friday, April 13th, 2007. Robert Williams Landscaping was well represented at this happy, joyful event. Both he and his crew were singled out for praise from several of the speakers, including Satwant and Prakash the priest. And praise would come throughout their relationship with the addition of a tree here, more playground equipment there, benches throughout the grounds. Bob and the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin were truly partnering in providing members with the peace and serenity necessary for an uplifting experience while worshiping and visiting. And more and more members were visiting. Not really visiting, more like escaping from what the outside world was presenting to them and perceiving of them. Although the 5th largest religion in the world, most people were unaware of Sikhs. What they were aware of was Muslims. And there was a significant portion of the United States that considered Muslims terrorists and traitors. Osama bin Laden controlled all Muslims. Muslims were bad. Unfortunately for Sikhs, both Muslims and Sikhs wore turbans. Most of these hate groups didn't do any research on the subject. Turbans equaled Muslims. Muslims were bad. Sikhs wore turbans. Sikhs were Muslims. Bob might have been the least prejudiced person in the state of Wisconsin. His parents had taught him at an early age that all people were the same, no matter their gender, color, or religion. The only thing that separates us, his father would say, is us. We decide whether to accept or reject, whether to love or hate. Then he'd tell Bob the don't judge a book by its cover story again. Bob spent hours defending his Sikh clients' friends to others, those that didn't understand. He also found himself working at the temple quite a bit, helping his crew out maintaining the grounds. He liked it there. He not only appreciated his craftsmanship, but he also liked the way he felt when he was there. Quite often he'd find himself sitting with Satwan and or Prakesh on the bench over near the playground, just chatting, passing the time. He'd even sit with Ranjit from his crew when they were done, finding out when he'd be able to bring his brother Sita over, chatting about his family. He found being there at the Temple Gurdwara, talking with his friends, the most relaxing part of his day. Almost therapeutic. On Sunday, August 5th, 2012, Bob was in his Oakview Business Park offices working on a new landscaping project for a company that was moving to a South Howell Avenue location. Although he had already done his due diligence as far as the site was concerned, he felt that another look-see might help sort things out. Plus, it was about time for the Sikh service. Satwan had explained to him the 4 parts of the Sunday service. It started at 8:45 a.m. with the Asa Devar, the singing of 24 stanzas written and brought together by the Gurus, founders of Sikhism. Bob found it melodious and soothing. The Simran was basically a period of meditation. The members sat cross-legged on the floor and either uttered or chanted the name of God, Nam. The Qurbani Kirtan was the singing of Sikh hymns. Bob would tell Satwan that their service had this calming, soothing effect on him. Like when he was a kid, watching The Joy of Painting with Bob Ross on his PBS station Saturday mornings. Rhythmic, melodic, quiet, simple. Satwan would laugh, knowing Bob meant it as a compliment. My friend, that is not exactly what we're aiming for. At 1 p.m. was the Langar, a group meal where vegetarian food was prepared in the Gurdwara's large communal kitchen and enjoyed together on the floor by the membership. Once Bob had the timing down, he often just happened to be sitting outside and get invited in for the most delicious vegetarian meals he'd ever had. It was about 10:20 a.m. when he was in back, wandering the grounds behind the temple, listening to the service, thinking about heading to his work site and back so he could be in time for lunch, when he heard pop, pop, pop at the front of the building. Kids and their firecrackers, he initially thought. Hold it. Why would Sikh kids have firecrackers? Then he noticed the service had stopped. He heard more pops and screams. What the hell? As he dashed to the building. He looked in a window where the worship area was and saw people lying on the ground, motionless, and his friend Satwan wrestling with a white, balding guy in a t-shirt. He saw the guy shoot Satwan, who slumped to the floor. Oh my God, Bob heard himself scream. The guy then headed to the exit. Holy shit, he's shooting people. Bob called 911 and was informed police had already responded. He then heard multiple pops in the entrance area. The white guy was shooting at what looked like a downed police officer while other police vehicles were pulling in. Then he started shooting at the police vehicles and finally was stopped with a shot in the stomach. With Bob's viewpoint, he saw the guy put the gun to his own head and pull the trigger. Bob stood there, stunned. Then the police noticed Bob. You, on the hill, hands in the air, on your knees, now, now! It was on the second now that Bob realized they were talking to him. He immediately threw his hands up, dropped to his knees, and was surrounded by Oak Creek's finest. It was a few minutes before he was able to convince them that he was the temple's landscaper, there for a walk before heading to another site. Once he was cleared, he gave his statement, then went into the temple to see what had happened and if there was anything he could do. What he learned stunned him. His friend Satwan had attacked the guy with the only weapon he had near him, a butter knife. He was able to slow the guy down so that others could hide and escape. He was dead. So was Prakesh, the priest. He'd finally just brought his family to America from India 2 months ago. So was Ranjit, the Sikh in the crew, as well as his brother Sita, a sweet woman he'd met several times during his invitations to the Langar, was killed, the only female. It was the 6th victim that made Robert Williams sob uncontrollably on a stranger's shoulder. Suveg, sweet, funny, inquisitive, non-English speaking Suveg. As he heard the news, Bob stood there with tears in his face, surrounded by bullet holes, sobbing relatives and friends, police sirens continually coming into the compound. Then he heard it, as plain as if the old man were standing in front of him. In his wonderful, disjointed Indian English accent, he very clearly heard it. Goodbye, my friend Bob. Bob did all he could. He went with members and families to a local bowling alley where he tried to provide comfort. He participated in Monday's candlelight vigil, Tuesday and Wednesday's community vigils at Henry Miller Park in Oak Creek, and Friday's funeral services at Oak Creek High School, where thousands of people attended, including Sikhs from around the country. He was there providing support when they opened the temple Thursday morning. He was one of the volunteers who helped repair and patch all the holes in the Gurdwara, except for one, which would remain unrepaired, with a plaque underneath it. We are one. Then, for all intents and purposes, Bob was gone. Robert Williams Landscaping continued to provide the grounds maintenance for the temple, but only an emergency would bring Bob back to what had been his favorite location in Oak Creek. Stress, tension, and sorrow was what he felt when the work brought him back to the place where he had felt so much calm, serenity, and happiness. He did receive an oversized envelope from Columbine. Dear Robert, you gave as much to them as they gave to you, was how it began. He became Oak Creek 20, was contacted by Navy Yard 14 as a mentor, but didn't respond. Looked through the site, but his heart wasn't in it, which was just the way he felt about the temple. Finally, he told the foreman of that crew not to call him anymore, to handle all challenges to the best of his ability, and to not bring him back to the site. Bob's life moved on from that tragic day. He acquired new clients, continued growing his business, and became one of the movers and shakers in the Oak Creek community. He was Bob. Good old solid as a rock Bob. Until he wasn't. His father, Oliver, celebrated 40 years with Frontier Motor Cars on April 1st, 2016. He could have had a quality management position at Frontier or with any of the leading dealers, not just in Milwaukee, but in Wisconsin. But he was a salesman. He liked selling used cars and trucks. He liked what he did. He hated change. His office was lined floor to ceiling with sales awards. Salesman of the month, the year, in Milwaukee and Wisconsin in the United States. He was a noticeably big fish in a small pond, and he liked it that way. He was comfortable there. On Monday, August 1st, he was walking with a potential customer on the sidewalk in front of the show lot along South 27th Street. A 2008 blue Dodge Charger headed toward West Edgerton Avenue in the right lane of South 27th Street. It slowed down and stopped just in front of these two men. "Hey, Oliver," the driver called out. Oliver excused himself, walked to the open window, leaned in, and received 2 shots in the head from a 9mm Springfield XDM semi-automatic pistol. The same type of weapon used in the Sikh Temple shootings, from what police would describe later as a mentally disturbed individual, angry that Oliver had sold him a piece of shit, the Dodge Charger. Oliver Williams was 64 years old. Nancy fell to pieces. It was left to his son to identify the body at the Milwaukee County morgue, to plan Oliver's funeral, to find a cemetery. No one had discussed burial or cremation in their family. It was Nancy who screamed at Bob, "You will not burn your father up!" which ended up being Forest Hill Memorial Park in Oak Creek. It was Bob who emptied Oliver's office at Frontier Motorsports. Bob who had to listen to story after story about his late father and what a great guy / salesman / trainer he was. It was Bob who tried to bring Nancy around. Bob who talked to doctors and psychiatrists about medications for his mother. Bob who drove his mother to the wake and funeral in mismatching bright blue patterned slacks with an orange fluffy blouse, flip-flops, and bright red lipstick. Bob would have to physically remove Nancy from her husband's funeral after she started swearing and screaming at the top of her lungs. It was Bob who drove her straight to Ascension, Wisconsin Health Center in Mount Pleasant as an emergency patient and committed her for 30 days, then drove back for the end of the burial ceremony. After 60 days, Bob picked Nancy up from Ascension. He found her smiling, happy, and very apologetic for the way she had acted. After dropping her off at home and feeling comfortable enough to leave her alone, he went back to the office. When he came back home that night, walking up the walk toward the front door, Bob thought he saw water coming from the bottom of the door. He did. Opening the door, the water poured out. It was coming down the stairs from the second floor. Bob knew what was there before he made it to the bathroom door. He opened it and turned the tub off where his mother was. Razor blade to the veins. A short note. Robert, I love you. I can't live without him. Bob buried her next to Oliver. Bob spent thousands repairing and renovating the house. Even after new furniture, new paint, new carpets, new kitchen, and especially new bathrooms, Bob saw his parents everywhere. Bob spent thousands more on his own mental health. Depression, anxiety, stress. Sometimes one, sometimes all three now weighed heavily on him. Therapists, psychiatrists, various medications, even mental health trips to Mexico, Paris, and several ocean cruises. Nothing seemed to help. There was nothing he cared about. His business suffered as well as his relationships. His dating life was non-existent. Solid Robert Bob Williams was solid no more. For some reason, and he could never figure out why, he thought about the mass killing site, as he referred to it with Navy Yard 14. He reached out to Maxine, found in her at least a little comfort, did some more research, found out more about the site and about some of the other people who frequented it, reached out to a few of them, and felt himself relating more to people who'd experienced tragedy rather than those who hadn't. It wasn't until Navy Yard 14 had spent quality time with Bob that she mentioned the plan to him. Sure, he'd meet with someone. What did he have to lose? It was still Saturday, July 7th, 4 p.m. when Ray pulled up to a modest two-level house in a very well-kept neighborhood. Walked up to the door, rang the bell. Nothing. Knocked on the door. Nothing. Checked his notes and the address. 530 East Groveland Drive. Yep, address right. Ring the bell. Knock on the door. Again, nothing. Oh well, off to Minnesota. Then the door opened. Hi, you Bob? Yes, you must be Ray. Yeah, was there a problem? They're still at the door. I almost didn't open it. Why? Don't know. It just felt so pointless. Uh-oh, someone didn't take his medication. Do you mind if I come in? Sure. Ray went in, sat on the straight back chair next to the couch, which Bob sprawled in. This could be quick, Ray thought. Ray, okay. Pointless. Why? I don't know. I just don't have the desire to do anything. Should I or shouldn't I? Looking around quickly to be sure they were alone, Ray, being ever cautious, asked, Are you interested in finding out more of what Navy Yard 14 was talking with you about? Sure, that's why you're here, right? Ray felt himself getting a little testy. Calm down. Yes, it is, but you don't seem particularly interested in what I have to say. And honestly, there's a list a mile long of people who give far more of a shit than you do about gun violence that I could be spending my time talking to. Damn, got too angry. Bob just sat, staring at Ray for what seemed like hours. Then he unslouched, sat up in the sofa. Point well taken. I'm sorry. I was feeling a little sorry for myself. Please tell me about the plan. Well, medication kicked in. Ray spent the next hour going over the plan, interrupted by very thoughtful questions and comments from Bob. Finally, okay, Ray, I'm in. Are you sure? Let me phrase that a little better. When I showed up at your doorstep, I know I was the very last person in the world you wanted to see there. I've done enough selling in my life, so that fact was clear from the outset. A smile from Bob. Then I give you a little ration of shit, and suddenly you're with me in the room, asking excellent questions, in fact, questions no one has asked, and interjecting pretty insightful comments. So, what gives? Another Bob smile. The reason is pretty simple. You said something that struck home, that there was a list a mile long of people that cared about gun violence more than me. And that was the impression I knew I was giving off. Because I don't want to care. Honestly, Ray, I'm tired. I'm tired of caring. I'm tired of being. I'm tired. And I know part of that is depression. And yes, I'm taking my medications. Smiles from both. But when you said that, it struck home with me. I've been touched twice. 3 times, really, if you think about my mom's suicide, by gun violence. The first was the Sikhs. Most people aren't aware of them, Ray. Or fear them because of something they wear. Something they wear. A turban. A turban scares the hell out of a large group of people in this country, and it shouldn't. They are the nicest, kindest, most peace-loving people I've ever come across. I used to make sure I ended up outside the temple at 1 p.m. on Sundays because they'd always invite me in for their big community feast after services. Always. Then to be attacked by a white supremacist who thought he was attacking a Muslim temple. How does a white supremacist on the police and FBI radar legally purchase a 9mm Springfield XDM semi-automatic pistol? No questions asked. And by the way, that was the exact same gun that blew the back of my dad's head out. Bought by a guy with mental issues. Documented mental issues, and bought legally. Ray, I've been touched by gun violence far more than most. I was just afraid to care anymore. Honestly, on the path I'm on now, I'd probably end up like Mom in a few short months. I don't want to give up. I want to act for those who have too much love in their hearts to act for themselves. For my dad, for my friends Satwant, Prakesh, Ranjit, and especially Suveg, I'm in. Ray called Maxine from an Oak Creek gas station parking lot. He's in. Really? He seemed kind of wishy-washy when I talked to him last time. Yeah, well, this is probably the one and only time my temper came out positive. He related the conversation. Well, you hit the right button. He seems good about his decision. Yeah, gives him something to live for. Okay, off to Minneapolis. Minneapolis 31.